I think you're absolutely right. The shape of artificial intelligence now is not something that people of my generation had envisaged 5, 8 years ago. And I think you can sort of summarize, what now dominates the marketplace and the use of AI as generative AI. The notion that you could generate content of the kind that another person would generate. That was not foreseen as the essence of intelligence. So, um, for decades, artificial intelligence was really, or the aspirations were more about emulating natural intelligence, reasoning, and deploying that reasoning sometimes in a sort of embodied context. So, the notion of sort of helper robots, for example, or autonomous vehicles. So, not just thinking about states of affairs in the world and trying to make predictions, but use those predictions to underwrite how to actually act in the world at many different timescales, whether we're talking about sort of financial services, fintech, um, or whether we're talking about autonomous vehicles or drones, for example, very different timescales. But the idea being that if you intelligently sense make about your particular world, then that provides a foundation for acting in that world and also, calls into question, what it is to be an agent and what agents, aspire to. So much of the work in artificial intelligence was really trying to step towards the those aspects of natural intelligence, which is not the same direction of travel that we've ended up at, which is basically marveling at this beautiful piece of engineering, which just generates content of the sort that you and I would generate, whether it's music, whether it's prose, whether it's mathematical, whether it's code, whether it's videos or pictures or drawings. At the end of the day, it is all. I think the allure of AI, as your generation would know it, is, or perhaps younger people would know it. I think the allure of it is that it's so easy to identify with it because it's the kind of thing that I could do, or if I had sufficient knowledge or experience or skill, the kinds of things that I could produce. So it's not, it's a sort of content orientated sort of artificial intelligence. And perhaps retrospectively, one shouldn't be surprised at that in the sense that if you are going to make the inference that this artifact is intelligent, then the best meter, the best measure of its intelligence is how similar it is to you. So if it starts to produce the same kinds of things that you produce, that is quite prescient evidence that this thing must be intelligent, or the simplest explanation for this artifact, this iPhone, this chatbot, is that well, the simplest explanation for the cause of what it is generating is it must be intelligent because it is like me and I am intelligent. So in retrospect, it's not so much of a surprise.
It's this interesting bifurcation, especially for my generation, but a lot of other people, a lot of other generations between I understand that the current zeitgeist of artificial intelligence is kind of like really powerful math and engineering and computer science is inside of a drone or inside of, a data center. But at the same time, my humanity, as it were, wants to call this artificial humanity. It's a muddy term, but let's just go with that just for the conversation. And so as I'm growing up, I'm not just, or I would like you to comment on that, but it's not just that I'm looking at ChatGPT as the purveyor of my essays. I'm actually looking at ChatGPT as something just a little bit more. I'm ascribing just a couple more human traits to it where it may be inappropriate. Do you see this? Can you understand why potentially younger people, but people in general would do that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in a sense, that's what I was trying to intimate. Given that these things are designed, and that's quite crucial actually, in the sense that somebody has to specify what these things do in terms of, for example, um, you know, deep RL or reinforcement learning. You have to have a value function that specifies when it's performing as you want it to perform. But somebody has to specify, a human has to specify that. So it is, I think, quite natural that the things that engage us are basically things like other people or things like me. And therefore, it's quite natural that people have learned that to sell stuff, you make it behave like me or like you. And of course, that's its selling power. That's, I repeat, its allure. The very fact it is behaving like, or at least generating content of the kind that I would generate, means that it is desperately easy to start to empathize and to start to project something of the human condition into the source of the content that your artifact is generating. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I want to ask you. We'll have to come back to the book um, at some point. But yeah, there are lots of vexed conversations around this that I've had with people. So I'm just going to reflect a couple of perspectives that may speak to your question. One set of conversations with people like Mustafa Suleiman, for example, who's very anxious about the um, over also underestimating people's ability to know that this is not a conscious artifact and it is not a real person. Because if you now overplay the possibility, the conviction, the inference that this machine has a kind of intelligence that could be comparable to your intelligence or my intelligence, then you enter the murky world of machine welfare. Um, and that can be a murky world potentially because you are now treading on the toes of all sorts of ideological debates that can very easily turn toxic. The kind of debates that we have about, well, are tiny creatures, are unborn children, are they sentient and have that? Do we have the moral ethical responsibility to a tiny creature that we would to another human being? And if so, is there any fundamental difference between this chatbot and a tiny creature? It behaves very, very similarly. And how would you ever know whether there is the capacity for suffering, for example? So that's one sort of line of argument about not so much, um, you know, is it right or wrong to imbue artifacts with a certain kind of sentience, a condition that mimics the human condition, but just allowing that to be a meme will, in principle, present quite profound difficulties in the future when we come to regulation, to putting constraints on the use of or the development of artificial intelligence. Another kind of conversation, which is in completely opposite direction, one would have with people in psychology and psychiatry. So I have colleagues currently at University College London who are now researching the impact of interactions with chatbots, for example, in um, in the context of mental well-being, more specifically, mental disorders and mental health. Is there a an interaction between people who may have a predisposition, say, to psychotic breaks or to certain neurotic disorders, possibly involving, say, interpersonal relationships, right through to self-harm? Is there any role of a malevolent or possibly beneficial um, sort that could be ascribed to interactions with artificial intelligence and chatbots? So this is something which people don't know and are currently now starting to research in terms of this particular kind of sort of machine psychosis induced by interactions with the machine. So that's a whole other sort of, another area, a vexed area, which goes beyond, simply treating your chatbot like you imbuing a sentience and a personality, uh, imbuing your chatbot with a personality, in the same way that you would your pets. So we all, have quite intense, well, a lot of us have quite intense relationships with our pets, and we humanize them and anthropomorphize them. And just the existence of things like therapy dogs, for example, are a testament to this. So, is that, a good model for the way that we treat chatbots? And if it is, then that would, I think, be a completely licensed and, acceptable kind of projection and, anthropomorphizing these things. But, I've just given you two examples where things could potentially go wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things, especially when you're talking about machine psychosis. It's one of those things where Gen Z can only interact with the machine as much as they know how to interact with themselves. And so there's no novelty in the interaction because their worldview and their world models in a very real way are so skewed around technology already that the arrow towards the machine, there's no arrow going back. It's just their perception of an arrow going back. It's their assumption of the arrow coming back. And so when Gen Z are interacting with not just machine psychosis from like a chat GPT, but Gen Z have actually been going through machine psychosis since they were 10 because of technology in some way, with their interactions with social media and stuff. It's just a different kind of psychosis because that was more lingering, more in the background, and then it happened, kind of like the Hemingway novel. It happened gradually and then suddenly, like the bankruptcy thing. Um, so as Gen Z are interacting with technology, this is shaping their interactions with everything else. So as we explored in the book, which I know you really wanted to get to, as we explored in AI for Gen Z, the first part talks about Gen Z and who they are and what they stand for. And we talked about COVID and jobs and the workplace and climate change and such. And Gen Z have all these statistics going around, the way that they use social media for climate change, protesting, for example, the way that they job hop, the term quiet quitting, for example, to describe how Gen Z are only doing what's required of them at work and not going above unless they get better pay, for example. During COVID, where their mental health plummeted because they were constantly online and not able to have any social interaction. So all of these things, and we look at these variables as independent, as just, this is for climate change and this is for COVID and this is for jobs, when actually it's part and parcel of being a young person growing up in the digital age is having these interactions and not looking at these interactions as negative or bad, but looking at them as, well, what else did you expect? My primary medium as a young person is going to be online. So instead of creating a sign and getting my pitchfork and going outside on the streets of London, for example, I'm gonna post online. It's much better on my couch than it is on the cold street, right? It's gonna be very cloudy over there. Instead of tolerating certain people at the workplace, I'm just gonna quit and find another job because I have LinkedIn and I can apply to 100 jobs, whereas before it took me a week to apply to 3. So all of these things from somebody that's looking for on the outside in, what are your perspectives on these things? Do you see power in this? Do you see not sadness or pity, but do you kind of scratch your head and say, I wonder why they chose that route? Or is it a mix between the two?
Well, having read your book, I now understand. And so, no, I don't think it's sad, but it's illuminating, and it may be the way of things. Um, you know, like, just to put things in context, is to sort of foreground your book. You don't know how I read it. So I was actually driving or being driven by my wife to see our first grandchild for the first time from London to the in the north of England, and I read it in the back of the car with my son, who is I presume a millennial, is sort of sort of mid late 30s, and we had the PDF, so I was reading a page and passing it to him, and we spent the entire 2 3 hour journey just riveted, and we actually read the entire book page by page during the drive up, fueled a really wonderful conversation with my wife, my son, and his partner on the drive back again. It was really quite insightful. And I was saying, oh, yes, but he was saying this and that. So some of the things you just mentioned, really did surprise me. Talking about the statistics, that, a substantial proportion of Gen Z do not want children. And this certainly resonated with my children. Now, to me, that is strange for my generation. The self models are sort of the priors of the scripts that one has for one's life were certainly would not admit not having children. That was that wasn't the thing that you
Exactly.
would even
Completely
count.
foreign thing to even
Completely
think.
foreign. But one thing which also resonated with something you were just saying about the nature um, of the way that we try to change the world, or certainly broadcast our responses to events, was that you seem to intimate that uh, most Gen Z, their ultimate aspiration was to be an influencer. And I found that quite touching. Wasn't that quite interesting? I certainly see that theme, um, you know, persistent through generations. But both as a sort of neuroscientist and a psychiatrist, and indeed looking back at I wanted to be an influencer, but I wanted to be an influencer by being a doctor, so influencing one person. I'm sure if you wanted to be a priest, that would be kind of an influencer. Got to be a politician, that would be kind of influencer. So your observation that the medium by which one now influences is social media, I think is quite a natural, well, I think an important observation, and certainly is entirely consistent with the notion that you are um, that's as part of seeking evidence for yourself, and I'm now sort of verging on active inference and the Fiente principles, sort of seeking evidence that you exist, and exist in a cultural niche that is compatible with your existence. You're certainly going to want to influence and at least broadcast to your niche the kind of thing that you are and how consistent and fit you are with that niche, with that echo chamber, with that group of people. And the most effective medium, as you know, uh, certainly from the perspective of Gen Z, is going to be social media. And I think that's that's quite an interesting and important observation, because it's the kind of interaction, the kind of cultural niche that just was not available, say, a decade ago. It just, or several decades ago, it just wasn't there. Um, and it has a certain structure to it, which, you know, I think beautifully exemplified by your observation, that who I connect with at work, is now, or used to be constrained by getting a job and applying for 200 jobs and getting one interview a year. Now the connectivity, the the dependencies are now so much, you are now liberated in a way which you previously weren't. And I think, on the one hand affords great opportunities. On the other hand, I can imagine it's quite terrifying. And I mean that in a sort of, in a psychological way. One trivial example here is that, there's a lot of work in decision making under uncertainty and choice behavior that has enormous implications in terms of how we choose how to act and the decisions we make, but also in say marketing. So if you give people too many choices, If I go to a supermarket and there are 8 kinds of tomatoes to choose from, that's actually quite upsetting because it just induces a lack of certainty and precision about what I'm going to do next. It's much more reassuring just to be able to choose that a tomato or an apple, as opposed to 10, different kinds of tomatoes. Because if you now translate that opportunity and that latitude to the choices that one makes when using social media or connecting with others, um, then one can see immediately that or one can empathize with the kind of angst that many people must have in terms of choosing what who to talk to or how to talk to them, because the arena of people that you could reach is just now so unconstrained, in exactly the same way that the vendors of tomatoes have occasionally failed to constrain your choice in that reassuring kind of way.
It's this strange but brutal race to the bottom when it comes to energy expenditure, because Gen Z don't want to get off their couch. At least right now, they don't want to get off their couch because they actually don't have any energy because they don't eat properly because they're constantly ordering from Uber Eats. But that's a separate discussion. To go in the street, for example, even their behaviors, like their respect for time, has been molested in some way because they don't need to go up to somebody of their romantic interest and actually look them in the eyes and create conversation and struggle through that human awkwardness. They just need to swipe. They don't need to, again, they don't need to cook. They just need to, order on Postmates, for example. Again, they don't need to go to a potential employer and hand in a physical resume and exchange pheromones and generate oxytocin from eye contact. They can just easily apply on LinkedIn. It's all convenience and being frictionless for them. And so when they're interacting and saying, well, what is the most convenient and frictionless job which becomes their career, they end up again finding influencing because they wake up, take a picture of their breakfast, and they have $50,000 going into their bank account, or at least that's the goal for them. And the medium of social media is so incredibly interesting, and we're going to be jumping ahead probably a little bit, but in part 3 we explore the 3 R's, reputation, a reward, reputation, and reach. We talk about the dopamine system. We talk about the evolutionary psychology, how that is affected on social media platforms. We talk about the actual reach of your devices being within your arm's grasp 24/7 all the time for your entire life. And so there's this very powerful intermingling of all these forces that kind of shape Gen Z and shape the generation as they come up. Do you, just before we move on, do you have any thoughts on this kind of like reduction of energy, like the energy going into the best pockets possible for them?
I did as you were thinking, but I was also enjoying your recounting of the. I mean, you should perhaps just take a couple of minutes just to overview the structure of the thesis that the book presented and sort of the highlights. You've actually done, I think, quite a lot of that. So you should indulge yourself, but I can't resist just commenting upon on the points you've already unearthed for us. Yeah, it is completely sensible that anybody, any sentient creature, is going to, in my world, choose the path of least action, the path of least effort. This is, again, from a theoretical point of view, from the perspective of active inference and the free energy principle. That is a least action principle. It is literally the most likely thing that I'm going to do is the most efficient, in the sense that it will be the most the path of least effort, where effort effectively here scores the departure from the kind of things that I do. So if I'm the kind of thing that is a couch potato, then I am going to be a couch potato. And this was going to be, from as a mathematical point of view, the the optimal way, the optimal way of behaving. So that's completely understandable. But I think underneath what you were saying was, this is a path of least action. should you find yourself in a situation where doing nothing is a viable option, and that if circumstances change and you find yourself in a different kind of universe, then you are going to be very ill-equipped with that approach to find your path of least action or path of least effort. So underneath the way that you framed it, I got a sense that there were dangers lurking if there were if, and of course, some of those dangers might be, is this kind of consumerism effectively sustainable? Because it may be the most efficient path of least action for the individual, but for a society to be able to maintain that kind of convenience culture, um, then there's going to have to be an enormous investment in energy, which is actually not the path of least action from a sort of sustainability goal perspective. So, one other way of thinking about the path of least action when it is violated is that you are taking an energetically very inefficient path. Um, and we see that around us now. We see that in terms of the building of data centers in Virginia, equipped with their own car parks and generators, and people complaining that their energy bills are climbing. The amount of consumption um, of energy that is required to support this kind of the way that we currently live online, is to my mind worrying. And I think also worries, and I'm no expert here, but it also worries the markets. For examples, the United States apparent, very healthy GDP for the past few years has been completely underwritten by investment in infrastructure to support exactly the kind of activities that you've been talking about. Is that sustainable? I mean, when you get to my age, and I imagine also in Gen Z, the answer is possibly not sustainable for too much longer, but we'll see, I guess.
Yeah, you can't have an infinite technosphere on a finite biosphere. And I'm I'm still confused as to how we've just focused on technology and specifically AI as this end all be all solution. Especially when all of these, teachings and such within the book are yes, are very not niched, but very, very N of one because they are from a Gen Z living in this time, so they couldn't have been had from anyone else. But at the same time, it doesn't take a genius to figure any of this out. Like the interactions with artificial intelligence, while again very, very unique to Gen Z, and that's where I guess we'll go in this next section. They're had by basically everyone. Artificial intelligence and social media as like the digital technology, under the digital technology umbrella. Yeah, the sustainability has always been in question, but it's always funny. Gen Z are just a microcosm of this, but especially for humanity, we love creating technology and then figuring out the ramifications afterwards, but then calling ourselves Homo sapiens, like wise. And the thing about being wise is that you thought about, a couple steps in the future and then recalculated to go through the best path, whereas we somehow never do that, and yet technology is supposed to be an augment of humans, whereas technology is actually taking us away from our humanity. So all of these different kind of ironies compile each other, and then you start realizing, it's the technology is not really technology because it's taking away my humanity. If I can't look at my fellow social human in the eyes, which is a very basic thing, the eyes we say the eyes are the window to the soul, but truly, like the eye contact is very important for human social dynamics. And my generation almost completely cannot make eye contact. Not because they cannot, in terms of like they're all blind or something, they don't have eyes. It's literally that behavior has not been installed in them because they have always been down here. And stuff like that. And that takes us into, again, the third part, which is it's called the case against the internet generation. And again, it's about the reward, reputation, and reach. And one of the most important things I think about that section is talking about the psychologies of my generation and how they use social media as an extension of their character, of their self-esteem. And so when they're on social media and they have followers, they're not looking at those profiles as just these instantiations of cyberspace that happen to have a linkage to them based on a username and a password. They're looking at that as another representation of their status in society, which has real neurological and mental effects and psychological and real harmful effects to them. Because, for example, if you have 50,000 followers and I have 50, as a Gen Z, I look at you like you have far more social status than me. I'm more likely to go to you and do you favors and such. It's very similar to the hierarchies of chimps, for example, where, the alpha will get the favors from everybody else because of that status. This is a very new thing. I don't think you think in this way at all, but for myself and my generation, when we look at people with thousands and millions of followers, that actually means something to us. I'm guessing it doesn't mean something to you.
Um, I'm not so sure. I mean, obviously, followers per se. You're absolutely right. I don't actually I don't have a mobile phone, let alone a social media account. Um, But I have to say, part of effectively my vanity is the degree to which people cite my academic papers in academia. So that would be for my generation, the homologue of the like button. Um, and just to slip in, a colleague of mine has actually, I think, within the past 9 months, has written a book about the like pattern. It's absolutely fascinating. Um, I mean, I think that sort of touches upon the reward aspect, the likes. So for me, the like button, the number of likes I get is basically the number of times people cite my work. Um, and that is consonant with being an influencer. I have impact, and indeed, you are valued as a scientist, literally, in terms of the degree to which you have impact, i.e., influence, on the basis of how many times your work is cited. So I don't think there's a massive leap from the number of likes, the number of followers, from what has always been regarded as markers of esteem in science, in religion, and possibly even in politics, in the very simple sense that a politician wants votes. So it's just another kind of like. These are good measures of your esteem. And dispassionately, if we just sort of remove, any sort of valence to esteem, what is esteem? It's just evidence that you are a good fit to your cultural niche. And we'll come back again to this notion of, we are all one reading of pursuing these most efficient paths of least action. When you now read the action in terms of the statistical evidence for your world models, then what that means is all our behavior can be read as seeking evidence for our model of the world. And I would imagine likes and votes and citations are all evidence that I am here. They validate me. Again, I was touched by your by your sort of like observation that that Gen Z can't look people in the eye, and that you can see, I can now, when you say it, I can understand they just haven't got the right kind of motor skills there. It's and again, implicit in that is at some point they're going to have to look somebody in the eye. And therefore they may not have the right kind of world model, the right kind of skills that may be necessary should the sources of likes or followers now be denied to them in a different kind of niche, in a different kind of sort of sphere of interaction. And just one thing which sort of, I found the way you described that very compelling was that, a lot of work in developmental psychology and in fact, sort of developmental neurorobotics, for example, understanding the genesis of the way that we are, how we build models of ourselves, um, rests upon, first of all, appreciating that there are others. So, there is an argument. You can't have a sense of self without the notion of other. And of course, what's the most important other? Well, it's mother, it's your mum. So you spend the first months, if not years, of your life just basically learning that your universe comprises another, and that another is your caregiver, your nurturer, usually your mother, and that rests upon really, foundationally important dyadic interactions that are embodied, including the ability to look people in the eye. And there are people who, um, think that epigenetically we are born with the ability to recognize certain symmetries and to recognize, and we are, if you like, drawn to looking at faces so that we can recognize and we can become skilled in terms of eye to eye contact and all sorts of other things. Affiliative touch would be a really important one. So, when you were talking and describing the potential skills that have not been leveraged or exploited or nourished by just interacting with your iPhone, the list of them is actually quite worrying in the sense that they are all so central to developing a sense of other and therefore a sense of self. Affiliative touch, eye contact, um, joint attention. So people learn that if I see you looking over there, then that means that there's something of epistemic value over there, which means I should look over there. So this is a mechanism. This is the first mechanism, sort of knowing that you are looking at something is one of the first mechanisms that we learn to share our attention and to share an understanding what is salient and what is important in the world. So these are fundamental skills that speak to the embodiment or the embodied aspect of intelligence that we are embodied brains. And I could go off on a riff. It'd be wonderful if you were able to interview Andy Clark. So Andy Clark brought to the table this notion of, amongst others, the designer environment. So this was a sort of concept in the 90s that, we co-construct our own environment, and it sort of very much related to sort of extended cognition, that somehow now my memory gets into my phone. Because I don't have to remember your phone number, because my phone will remember your phone number. So suddenly my brain is now extended. It's much bigger than my actual skull-browned sort of fleshy organ. It actually includes a bit of tech. So that was state of the art at the turn of the century. And what one aspect of that was this notion of the designer environment, that we co-construct our own environments to make it predictable and supply the evidence that I've got a good model of my world, which is that my world is predictable. So now, in the context of social media, the digital age, as you have experienced it, it'd be great to see what Andy thinks. Because this is basically the designer environment on steroids, and all the dangers that might ensue from the point of view of a failure to recognize that we do actually have a body. We are sort of biological entities, and that sort of just licenses me to just to nod to another line of thinking, that all intelligence and has to be embodied, and people like Anil Seth have certainly promoted that. Our colleagues Giovanna Pizzulo, along with Andy Clark, in fact, we wrote a paper at the inception of generative AI and the excitement, and is it going to take overnight? And I remember right at the end of the paper, we concluded something which you actually spoke to about 20 minutes ago, that that yes, this generative AI, in the sense that it is producing all the kind of content which we marvel at, is effectively holding up a wonderful mirror to ourselves. Look at what we can do. But the killer line is, but when you look behind the mirror, there's nothing there. And I think that's what you were intimating before, that you know you get out what you put in, but nothing more. There's nothing beyond. There's nothing behind the so this would be the chatbot line. Um, I'm not sure that that kind of argument applies to sort of social interactions and like buttons and followers. There clearly is something out there, but again, it's possibly something very much like me, but disembodied um, and not noble in the sense that you would know your partner or your parents or your children. Is that what
Yeah,
you were getting at?
absolutely. These are fascinating lines of conversation, and you're absolutely right. It's holding up a mirror and then going behind the mirror and kind of getting like an amnesia. I don't necessarily know what happened, and but you still have the text. You still have the generated, perfected prose. I call it like corrupted perfection because there's something about human generated writing, like a Kafka, for example, that there's just so much chaos within it. Like any person that really understands the writing can see there is just it's like a scream, or like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, for example, in the Gulag Archipelago. Those are not words. Those are like, pages of screaming out of your mind, and needing to put it on a page. It can't be generated from a prompt. And so whenever I'm interacting with anything AI generated, I'm always just saddened because it's like we're going towards, it's like a really incredible chef going towards like a 3D printer that's gonna, create like a little candy, right? And the chef has all the tools to create that candy, and the chef, it's not gonna make it in perfect symmetrical things, but it's gonna be so much better because you made it. You were the human. And it feels like for my generation especially, let me hold that thought because you asked about the thesis. The thesis of the book essentially is supposed to be about what does the first generation of humans that were affected by digital technology look like? It's just like a documentation in human history of if people asked how the internet affected people and they wanted to go to the first generation that were incredibly and absolutely and totally affected by it, they would find Gen Z to be that generation because we were the only first generation to fully grow up within digital technology. And so the thing I find so sad is Gen Z, by definition now, have no real relation to their humanity because they never were able to fully understand their humanity in the same way as, it makes sense that they don't make eye contact because they never were able to fully practice those motor skills. It goes far more meta than that because they were never able to fully practice their humanity because they were never given access to their humanity in the first place, at least full access. And so, especially for young people, and the thing I try to talk to both young people and older generations about is getting back there. And it looks different for, I think, everyone. And this is why I want there to be collaboration between generations rather than Gen Z dismissing. But I really do feel like there's a moment that can be had in this world where the technology can be unsustainable, but our humanity doesn't necessarily have to be corrupted with that. And that feels a little bit, not hippy dippy, but it feels a little bit idealistic at times, just to, kind of hand wave and dismiss technology and say, let's just find our humanity. But I really do think that if Gen Z understand how destructive technology has been for them, they can also be the first generation to say, well, it has been is it destructive, but let's figure it out. Let's talk to the worldly generations and use their frameworks in order to figure it out ourselves as well. Let's actually have those conversations. Let's be quiet and ask better questions. Let's figure out what mistakes that they made so that we don't have to make those same mistakes. And this is the thing that I try to also talk about in the book, is that Gen Z have all the power within them already. Just like they can do all the writing, they can make the candies, but it's just about getting them to understand that. So that's my spiel. I'd love for you to comment on that.
Well, no, let me ask you a question there. I mean, one aspect of that, which is a very compelling thesis. So, if are you saying that there is an opportunity for Gen Z now to acquire some of the skills that their failure to epistemically forage for the skills that other generations might have. Are you saying there's an opportunity for them to learn these skills now? And if so, how would they do that practically? And what are the downsides of that? And I ask as a psychiatrist, also as a theoretician, that it's always a big ask to change your generative models of the world, your world models, especially when 99% of your world model is basically a model of me in the world. To change, there's going to be a grief reaction. There's going to be all the sort of the pain of updating your world model of exactly the same kind that would ensue should you lose a loved one, for example. Your world changes. So, how do you envisage? What kind of program would you send sort of company of Gen Z people onto?
It's a great question, and I don't necessarily see it as kind of like a death of a world model. I just see it as kind of like getting an application update. Like Gen Z are very used to things dying in cyberspace, right? Like they can't ever get we talk about memes, for example. So one of the culturally relevant memes is like the Instagram application, the old icon, right? That's never coming back, right? And so they're very used to these things dying and being replaced by different things. Uh, Email, for example, Vine, a social platform from 2013. All of these things died, but they also came back in better ways and in different ways, but in better and more powerful ways. And so for Gen Z, I don't see it as kind of like put down your phones and never use them again and halt all electronics. I think it's more of a conversation, again, with worldly generations of, well, what worked for you and what didn't work for you? Let's just start there. One of my friends was talking about this, and he was saying, I'm so excited for your generation because your relation to time is so much more collapsed than ours, where we think in decades, you think in hours. And so with Gen Z, their again relation to solving problems is not going to necessarily be in the policy of let's put it back until 2035 and slowly work towards that. Gen Z might think, well, no, we can figure that out now. We can probably gather a bunch of people and create a technology or create a business or create an organization and diffuse those memes in a different way. So all of these things, like Gen Z are fantastic at being creative. That's again part and parcel for the generation. They can revolve around things and attack things and point things out that would have never been observed or let alone revealed if it were not for the strength in numbers and also the audacity of the generation, because again they post whatever they want online. And so it doesn't happen often, but it doesn't never happen where they will post something online and it just takes off because it just makes sense. They've identified the exact thing that a human feels, where they couldn't identify it here intellectually, but they felt it here emotionally. And the thing I would tell this is what I tell all young people is that burning desire that you have, use that anger you feel about being born in the wrong time in history or whatever, that's valid. It's not like a Gen Z complaint or whatever. That's a valid feeling, but use that to better yourself. Use that to ask more questions. Use that to send more emails to people that inspire you, to try to get on call and have those conversations. Use that to create works and create pieces of content that move the needle forward. The thing that I try to, again, tell young people is that, and this is where the book kind of starts wrapping around itself, is that just because your first piece of content doesn't have 50,000 views and likes and impressions and buys doesn't mean it's useless. This is the thing that I'm trying to get them to understand, is that just because content at the jump is not going viral doesn't mean it doesn't have purpose and meaning in terms of the art form and in terms of what it's trying to say. And this is understood by worldly generations all the time. You have to start somewhere in order to get where you want to be. But Gen Z have a very high barrier to entry on that. So it's just about working and having those conversations with them and getting them to understand things from different perspectives. And not everybody is going to understand everything at once. I think the most important thing about emotional intelligence is that you can work with them one to one and try to give them understandings and work with their specific psychology and get them to a place. But the thing that gives me so much inspiration as well is that once Gen Z do have that understanding, they will take it and they will run with it. They will figure out a way to change the world. And those are the ways that I think that we can really have a different, I won't say change the world, because I know Mencken said that people confuse the appetite to change the world with the hunger to rule it. So I won't say change the world, but I will say enact a future that works better for them.
That was a very positive, yes, thank you. That was a very, very positive. So just to paraphrase what I took from the sort of middle section of that, which is something which I hadn't really picked up on properly previously. You seem to be saying that Gen Z have, in virtue of some of the transient aspects of the world, the culture, their lived world are basically online. Um, they have become very adaptable, creative, fast, adaptable. So they're used to change. They're used to things coming and going. And that and I got the sense that you were saying, that can be purpose. That's a very positive thing, that adaptability. And it certainly makes a lot of sense from the perspective of my generation, but also the perspective of the theoretical biology underneath that at two levels. One to be adaptive means that you have to um, do something which you refer to, which is go out there and be curious. You have to. So one important aspect of self-evidencing from a purely technical point of view is to in resolve surprise, resolve uncertainty. You have to be curious to get the right kind of evidence that you exist in the right kind of way in your world. So curiosity, is I think a really important aspect, and it certainly seems that Gen Z can be curious if you point them to some sphere um, of epistemic affordances. Um, the other thing that it reminded me of, and this is in part response to your question or to your notion that they should talk to other generations. I'm not sure that really works from the point of view of theoretical biology and natural selection. I'm not sure. What you're hoping for is that basically natural selection will do its own kind of self-evidencing and select the right phenotypes for this stage in the development or the evolution of the human race. But one interesting aspect, which may well be another way of celebrating what you were celebrating in terms of the adaptiveness and the flexibility and the capacity to explore new ways of doing things that you seem to be attributing to Gen Z. It reminds me very much of, in the complexity sciences and indeed theoretical biology, the notion of selection for selectability, or sometimes known as second order selection. Stuart Kaufman in the 1990s and subsequently talked about this. And I remember reading as a young man evidence for this remarkable capacity that our adaptability, our flexibility, exactly of the kind you were describing, is itself subject to selective pressure when the world is changing. So, my favorite example of this, which has been celebrated by people like Ernst Mayr right through to Stuart Kaufman, is fruit flies. If you breed fruit flies, and then you suddenly introduce environmental volatility change by, usually experimentally, varying the temperature, you actually increase the mutation rate of the genotype of the fruit flies. So the fruit flies now become more adaptive. You're selecting for selectability, and it sounds as if you've just described Gen Z in this fast-changing world now uh, coming back, and we are in terms of in cultural selection, sort of neo. Beyond Lamarckian or sort of evolutionary psychology, it sounds as if we're at a phase of the development of our ecosystem where things are volatile, and they're open, and there's lots of choices to be made in terms of, again, coming back to sort of the the over connectivity that young people have to experience, and that this has resulted in an increase in people's adaptability and adaptiveness and flexibility at the right time, so they can respond to these changes, in a much more efficient way than somebody like me who is stuck in a rut, who now can construct their own little world, which is entirely predictable. But of course, that is not what you need when the world is changing quickly. So perhaps what we're seeing is just quite a natural self-organizing aspect, sort of, an aspect of this sort of well, again, I come back to this sort of self-evidencing take on self-organization. Um, that at the evolutionary level would be effectively selection for, meta selection or selection for selectability. So on that view, Gen Z should not listen to people like me. So that they should celebrate where they're going next, and I will admire.
I don't
Um,
know. I would say that they should listen to folks like yourself and folks not unlike yourself, to get a broader worldview. One of the things that Gen Z again has grown up in echo chambers, and so their ability to
and, yeah.
to interact with different perspectives is almost no. And that's why they have a fundamental inability to interact with, like, let's say, a different political perspective than the one that they are accustomed to, because number one, the algorithm doesn't show them that because of time on site metrics. It's not economically feasible. And so psychologically, when they interact with somebody, they're probably interacting with the very extreme, or they're assuming that they're interacting with the very extreme view from that political side, because number one, the algorithm probably showed them the very extreme thing, because that is the only thing that made it to their algorithm, because it was the very extreme version. And so any interaction with those political views for them is only characterized by the most extreme, most polarizing, most emotionally destructive perspective. And so their view of the world is incredibly polarized and very, there's no nuance to it. There's a bunch of nuance on their side, but they don't consider nuance on the other side. And so the question, I guess, for you is there a way to walk back from free energy? So if everybody is going towards the least amount of energy used, is there a way for Gen Z to say, no, I want to use more energy. I want to walk back from that. I actually want to walk back from that. I actually want to not suffer, because people get intimidated by that, but I actually want to struggle with this and work things out and use more brain power in order to figure something out. Does that make sense? Would that make sense for a biological being?
Yes, yes. And it reminded me very much of, I think, you spent the previous 5 minutes celebrating the potential of Gen Z, and now we're sort of dealing with the psychopathology of Gen Z. And I think, again, wonderfully articulated. And it did remind me very much of um, theoretical formulations of several psychiatric conditions. And the common thread here, the cross-cutting theme, is if you get locked into a behavior that precludes seeking evidence that you and the world could be in another, be in a different state, or be a different kind of world, then you are, if you like, locked in, not because you can't change, or you can't adapt flexibly to a changing situation, but simply your behavior stops you gathering evidence that you could cope or you could enjoy this style of interaction. So I'm thinking here of things like obsessional compulsive disorders, or let's just take an even simpler example, social withdrawal associated with a depressed mood that may have been induced um, by some um, social interactions which were considered to be very aversive. So what's a natural response? What's a base optimal? What's a sort of a free energy minimizing response to the evidence that a dyadic interaction with people, particularly people of this sort, renders me very surprised, very upset, and damaged in some way? Well, then I am now going to build a belief that this kind of interaction is not the kind of thing that I engage with. It's not a source of evidence that, is consistent with what, I am a person who is not offended, is not insulted, is not damaged in some way through interactions. So I'm going to socially withdraw. If I socially withdraw, that's entirely base optimal, and there are people who have written papers about sort of the functional aspects of being able to be anxious and to be depressed. The problem with some of these behaviors, in particular the withdrawal behavior, is that if you withdraw, you're denying yourself the opportunity to challenge your hypothesis that interactions with others or other kinds of things are not harmful. So it's one of these self-maintaining kind of behaviors that preclude the epistemic foraging that we were talking about before, that keeps you locked into these things. So what's the therapy? What's the response? It's exactly what you described earlier on when you were recounting different ways in which you would get Gen Z out there. So if you just take the metaphor of how would I treat somebody who is extremely withdrawn, and the analogy here is that the scope of evidence seeking and exchanges has now been severely limited to my echo chamber. And I know that looking elsewhere is going to be harmful. I'm going to see something awful, and therefore I'm not going to do it. Therefore, I'm not going to ever experience any evidence that, in fact, oh, that other point of view or that other perspective or that kind of person or that kind of society, actually has something which, possibly a source of self-evidence or indeed self-esteem. Um, so how would you treat somebody like that? Basically just two approaches. It's either drugs or psychotherapy. Um, so the, and psychotherapy can come in two flavors. You can either have cognitive behavior therapy or sort of talking therapy. Um, I think what you're talking about is either the use of the right kind of drugs. And I'm not being facetious. Biological psychiatry rests very much upon um, um, changing the way in which we build models of the world, and in particular attend to different sources of evidence through prescribing drugs that act on neuromodulatory systems that are in charge of nuancing the attention or the conviction we have in certain in my world, the precision afforded certain beliefs, particularly about how I'm going to behave. Interestingly, that's exactly the role of dopamine, which we mentioned earlier on, which probably we don't have time to get to now. But in the brain, dopamine would be basically the way, or the release of dopamine signifies an increase in the confidence or the precision or the attention afforded a particular course of action, a path into the future. Um, and so you can interfere with these things using drugs, prescribed in a judicious fashion. But the other two kinds of therapy would be sort of cognitive behavior therapy would probably be the most effective here. And what is that? At its simplest, it is basically obliging, either by accompanying the patient or the Gen Z, um, uh, and taking them out into the world again, so that you force them to behave in a way which, left to their own devices, they wouldn't do. And then the idea being that they are actually performing their own little experiments. So you just invite them to ask, well, look, you're not talking to this person, or you're not considering this point of view, or you're not engaging in this kind of way, or say in this, say, sport. Um, 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 can you tell me why? And they'll say blah blah blah, and you say, well, that's a hypothesis. Why don't we test it? Why don't you actually go and play this kind of sport? And then come back, write down your responses and just test the hypothesis. So this is explicitly this, if you like, enabling somebody to gather evidence for or against their own convictions, prior beliefs, and then updating and revising the beliefs. And you said earlier on that, in fact, it may be that Gen Z are particularly good at being able to update and revise their beliefs. When you were talking about, they are used to things going away and to other things emerging. That suggests to me that they do have, quite a potential to update their beliefs if they were confronted with the right kind of evidence that would do the updating. So you have to enable them to gather the evidence. So you can literally take them by the hand, and this is what a cognitive therapist might do, behavioral therapist might do, sometimes cast in terms of flooding or exposure therapy. So if you're frightened of bees, for example, you're never going to stroke a bee, and therefore you'll never get any evidence that actually bees don't always destroy you, sting you, or harm you. But you actually have to touch the bee to realize that. And so you can expose people to bees, and then they can learn, oh, it wasn't that awful. The other way is talking therapy, which I think is what you're doing now. I mean, you're not doing it to a Gen Z person, but you're putting this as a documentary record of the potential utility of mentalizing the situation, revisiting certain convictions and prior beliefs, and the potential benefits of rehearsing the what beliefs about yourself and the style of your interaction, and just starting to question the conviction, or the precision afforded those, and the conviction placed in those kinds of beliefs. So that would be like psychotherapy, and you can do that for yourself as well. Sometimes you can do a sort of meditation and mindfulness practice, and again, that from my perspective, this is basically to become skilled managing your own um, neurobiological implementation of things that cause you to be stuck in a rut. Again, coming back to dopamine, if you can sort of get volitional control over these vitally important neurotransmitters that configure our attentional set, and the confidence or the precision placed upon, in terms of certain convictions relative to the sensory evidence, for example, then you're in a much more powerful position to be curious again, and to start to challenge the various beliefs.
If you could give yourself one piece of advice at any age, what piece of advice would it be, and what age would you give it?
My response to this question is always keep your options open, which is very interesting given what we've just been talking about, which is precisely how do you keep your options open, or more importantly, how do you enable people to discover and explore the options that are available to them. So that, and at what age? I think it's when you start to think. I was really taken by your description earlier on about Gen Z thinking hours to days ahead, whereas when I was in my adolescence, I was exactly thinking decades. Well, if I go to university, I do that. If I do stage management for the Welsh National Theatre, I'll have that kind of life. And these were real decisions you have, but it was always projecting 5 or 10 years into the future. So I think the point at which you do that is clearly the point at which you leave your mum and dad, if you're looking after to have an intact family. So I think we're talking sort of late teens. I think that when you're thinking about the kind of person you are going to be, and of course that defines. In the old days, this would be called a script, for example. In terms of the active inference, it would be basically refining your self model, the prior beliefs about the kind of thing that you are, so that provides a target for all the decision making subsequent to that, or at least provides constraints on the kind of decisions you would make. So I would guess in the late teens that that you need to be told keep your options open. That's yeah, in terms of who you talk to, in terms of what you study, in terms of the skills that you develop. Do as many as you can. And then, I often have in mind a sort of, as you winnow down as you get older, and you become a curmudgeon or a sort of grumpy old man or woman, you're basically picking out those things that define the kind of thing that you are. But if you've got a very broad base, a broad foundation, then you have much more latitude to pick the kind of person you want to be. So start off, do as much as you can when you're when you're young.
In the last handful of days to last week, maybe last month, what's one thing that you saw in the world that gave you hope?
Well, we'll come back to my grandchild, the next generation. I haven't given up on
The
Gen
next
Z, but
generation.
there's always another one afterwards.
Absolutely. Neither have I. Dr. Friston, thank you so much for today. It's an absolute honor and a pleasure and a privilege uh, to be, reverse interviewed by you. Thank you so much for reading the book. Thank you so much for your compliments on it and for being here for your second time on the podcast. It's a, it's not just a dream of mine. It's far beyond that. So I really do appreciate
Well,
it.
thank you.
Thank you so
It's an
much.
honor to talk about it. And thank you so much for sending it to me. Yeah. And I hope you have a picture of it on the podcast so that people know what we're talking about. A wonderful read. Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll make sure to link your non-existent social media profiles. Um, but thank you, everyone.